The dust swirled around Beatrice Dawson's boots as she watched the last passenger car door swing open, her heart sinking with each man who stepped down from the Chicago train carrying the wrong face. She had studied the tintype photograph so many times the edges had gone soft under her thumbs, memorizing the weathered features of Quinn Lancaster, cattleman of Wyoming, a man whose letter had promised 20 years of range work and a steady hand with livestock. The advertisement she had placed in the matrimonial news had been specific. Widow with failing homestead seeks experienced rancher for partnership and possible marriage, must know cattle and hard work. His reply had arrived on cream-colored paper, the penmanship careful and assured, describing pastures and breeding stock and winter feeding strategies that had made her dare to hope her late father's dream might survive after all. But the man who finally emerged, scanning the platform with uncertain gray eyes, wore a suit so pressed the creases could have drawn blood. His shoes caught the afternoon light with a polish that had no business west of the Mississippi, and his collar stood so white and stiff it might as well have been a surrender flag. Beatrice felt her stomach drop through the worn planks beneath her feet. This could not be Quinn Lancaster. This could not be the man whose letters had spoken of mending fence lines in February snow and pulling breech calves at midnight. This was some Chicago clerk who had stumbled onto the wrong platform in the wrong territory. She watched him lift one polished shoe and grimace at the layer of Nebraska grit already clinging to the leather. He carried a single leather valise and a wooden crate that rattled with what sounded like books. His shoulders were broad enough, his hands large, but they looked like they had never touched anything rougher than a pen. When his eyes found hers across the thinning crowd, something in his expression shifted from confusion to recognition to what might have been dread. He walked toward her with the careful gait of a man navigating uncertain terrain. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 30, with dark hair combed back from a face that would have been handsome if it were not so pale and so obviously out of place. The Nebraska sun would burn him to blistering within a week. She crossed her arms and waited for the explanation that would make this make sense. "Miss Dawson." His voice was deeper than she had expected, educated but not affected. "I'm Quinn Lancaster." "No, you are not." The words came out harder than she intended, sharpened by months of hoping and the sick weight of disappointment. "Quinn Lancaster is a cattleman from Wyoming. You look like you have never been west of Lake Michigan in your entire life." A muscle worked in his jaw. He set down the crate with deliberate care. "I was a bookkeeper in Chicago until 3 months ago. I am also Quinn Lancaster, and I own 400 head of cattle on a claim 60 miles northwest of Cheyenne. I have never personally seen them, which is one reason I thought a partnership with someone who actually knows livestock might be mutually beneficial. My letters were honest about my experience with accounts and breeding records. I apologize if I was not sufficiently clear about my inexperience with the practical side of ranching." Beatrice stared at him. The words were coming too fast, her mind catching on the impossible parts. "You bought cattle you have never seen. You own a ranch you have never worked. What kind of fool does that? The kind who spent 15 years watching other men's money grow while his own life stayed small and gray." The admission came out quietly, almost lost under the hiss of the locomotive releasing steam. "I saved everything. I read every agricultural journal and market report I could find. When the opportunity came to purchase the herd and grazing rights from a widow moving back east, the numbers were sound. The investment was solid. I knew I could make it work if I found the right partner. Someone who knew the land and the animals the way I know figures and planning." She wanted to walk away. She wanted to climb onto her buckboard and ride back to the homestead. Her father had carved from prairie sod and let it fail the way it had been failing for 2 years, ever since his heart had given out during the autumn gather. She wanted to face the bank manager who came around every month with his polite threats and his calculation of how many seasons she had left before foreclosure. She wanted to do all of that alone rather than stand here with this man in his impossible suit who thought cattle ranching was something you could learn from journals. But the truth sat heavy in her chest. She had 9 breeding cows left from her father's original 30. The past winter had been brutal, and she had lost animals she should have been able to save if she had just had the money for better feed, better shelter, another set of hands. The spring calves had brought barely enough at market to pay the interest on the mortgage. She had placed the advertisement because she was desperate, because she knew the numbers as well as any bookkeeper, and the numbers said she would lose everything by next spring without help. My letters were honest too, she said finally. I have 160 acres, a house that needs a new roof, 9 cows, 1 bull, and a banknote that will come due in 18 months. I know cattle and horses and how to work ground that does not want to be worked. But I need capital, and I need labor, and I am running out of time. If you are really Quinn Lancaster, then you already know all of that because I put it in writing. I did know. I do know. He met her eyes steadily despite the awkwardness radiating from every pressed seam of his clothing. I can offer money for stock and improvements. I can manage the breeding records and sales and negotiate better prices than most ranchers get because I know how the markets move. I can learn the rest if you are willing to teach me. That was the arrangement we discussed, unless my appearance has changed the terms. She should say yes. She should tell him that city men in suits had no place on a working ranch and send him back to Chicago where he belonged. But there was something in the way he stood there, exposed and obviously aware of how ridiculous he looked, that stopped her. He had not lied. He had not pretended to be something he was not. He had simply failed to mention that his 20 years of experience were with ledgers instead of lariats. "Can you ride a horse?" she asked. "I have ridden in Lincoln Park, gentle horses on groomed paths. Can you shoot?" "I qualified expert with a rifle in the state militia. I have never shot at anything living." "Can you fix a fence, dig a well, deliver a calf?" "No, but I can learn and I will work until I get it right." His chin came up slightly, a thread of stubbornness showing through the uncertainty. "I did not come here expecting this to be easy, Miss Dawson. I came because I was suffocating in that city and I wanted a life that meant something. I know I look wrong. I know I do not fit. But I am here, and I am willing to do whatever it takes to make this work." The train whistle blew a warning, the engineer preparing to pull out toward the next junction. Around them, the platform was clearing, families collecting their arriving relatives, freight handlers loading crates onto wagons. The afternoon sun slanted through the dust, turning everything gold and temporary. Beatrice looked at this impossible man with his polished shoes and his crate of books and his honest gray eyes, and she made the only choice that made any sense at all. My buckboard is over there. The ride to the homestead takes 4 hours, and I only make the trip to town once a month, so if you have any other business in Willow Creek, handle it now. Relief broke across his face like sunrise. "Thank you. I will not disappoint you." "You already have," she said, but without the earlier edge. "Now we just have to see if you can do better." The ride north taught Quinn Lancaster his first lesson about the difference between reading about the West and living in it. The road was barely a road, just 2 ruts worn through prairie grass that stretched to every horizon in rolling waves of gold and green. The buckboard had no springs to speak of, and every rock and hole rattled through the wooden seat into his spine. Within an hour, Dust had coated his suit until the black wool looked gray. Within 2 hours, sweat had soaked through his collar, and his shoulders ached from bracing against the constant jolting. Beatrice drove with the easy competence of someone who had made this journey 100 times. She pointed out landmarks as they passed. The creek that ran dry by August, the stand of cottonwoods that marked the Haverson place, the ridge where you could see 3 counties on a clear day. Her hands on the reins were scarred and capable, the hands of someone who had worked hard all her life. She was perhaps 25, with dark blonde hair pinned in a practical knot, and a face that might have been pretty if it were not so guarded. She wore a split riding skirt and a man's work shirt, and she sat the buckboard like it was part of her. "You will bunk in the barn until we figure out the rest of the arrangement," she said as the sun started its descent. "There is a stove and a cot. It is clean enough. The house only has 2 rooms, and it would not be proper for you to stay inside until we are married, if that is even what we decide to do." "That seems reasonable." Quinn shifted on the hard seat, trying to find a position that did not make his back scream. "The letters mentioned marriage as a possibility, not a certainty. I appreciate you keeping an open mind given the circumstances." She shot him a sideways look. "The circumstances being that you are not remotely what I ordered. I suppose that is accurate." He allowed himself a small smile despite the discomfort. "Though I would argue that I am exactly what you ordered, just packaged differently than you expected. You wanted someone with capital to invest and knowledge of cattle markets. You wanted someone willing to work toward a shared goal. I can provide those things. The rest is just learning." "Just learning," she repeated, and there was something that might have been amusement buried in her tone. "You have no idea what you are talking about, but I suppose you will find out soon enough." The homestead appeared as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Quinn had never seen in Chicago. It was smaller than he had imagined. A single-story house built from sod and rough-cut lumber, a barn that leaned slightly to the north, corrals made from whatever wood had been available, and beyond it all, pastureland rolling away into the gathering dusk. He could see cattle, dark shapes moving slowly through the grass, 9 cows and 1 bull. The foundation of an empire if things went right, or the last remnants of a dying dream if they did not. Beatrice pulled the buckboard to a stop near the barn and climbed down with a fluid motion that made Quinn feel even more awkward as he levered himself off the seat. His legs had gone stiff during the long drive, and his first step nearly sent him sprawling. He caught himself on the wagon wheel and pretended he had meant to steady himself there. "I will show you where everything is," Beatrice said, already moving toward the barn. "Sunrise is 5:30 this time of year. I expect you out and working by 6. We check the herd first thing, make sure nothing got through the fence during the night. Then we mend whatever broke, feed the horses, and start on whatever project is most urgent. Right now, that is shoring up the north corral before it falls completely apart." She pushed open the barn door, and Quinn followed her into the dimness. The space smelled of hay and horses and old wood, comforting and foreign at the same time. She pointed out the stall where he could keep his things, the small iron stove for heat, the cot with its thin mattress and stack of wool blankets. It was spare and functional and nothing like the boarding house room he had left behind in Chicago, but it felt more honest somehow. "There is a pump by the house for water. Outhouse is behind the barn. I will bring you supper once I get something cooked." She paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light. "Quinn Lancaster, that really is your name." "It really is. My mother's father was from Lancashire in England. He wanted his grandson to remember where the family came from. And do you remember?" I remember that he wanted more for his children and grandchildren than what they had. I suppose that part carried through. She nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression. Get settled. I will be back in an hour. After she left, Quinn stood in the quiet barn and let himself acknowledge the full weight of what he had done. He had left behind everything familiar. The narrow office where he had worked for 15 years, the boarding house where he knew every creaking floorboard, the city whose streets he could navigate blindfolded. He had spent nearly all his savings on cattle and land he had never seen, and he had traveled halfway across the country to partner with a woman who looked at him like he was a mistake waiting to happen. He was terrified. He was exhilarated. He was more alive than he had been in 15 years. He changed out of his suit into the sturdier clothes he had packed, though even these felt too clean and new. When Beatrice returned with a plate of beans and cornbread and a mug of coffee, she looked at him for a long moment. "Better," she said. "You still look like you were dressed by a city tailor, but at least you are not going to ruin that suit doing real work. Eat. Tomorrow starts early, and I meant what I said about 6 o'clock." The food was simple and good, and Quinn ate every bite despite his exhaustion. After Beatrice left, he lay on the narrow cot and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie night. Wind moving through grass, cattle lowing in the distance, something small scurrying along the barn wall. The darkness was absolute in a way city darkness never was, and the silence was so deep it felt like pressure against his ears. He thought about the letters he and Beatrice had exchanged, the careful way they had both presented their assets and their needs. He had been honest about his financial resources and his inexperience with physical ranch work. She had been honest about her struggling homestead and her need for capital and labor. Neither of them had been looking for romance. They had been looking for a practical solution to practical problems. But lying there in the dark, Quinn remembered the way Beatrice had looked in the fading sunlight, competent and guarded, and carrying the weight of responsibilities too heavy for one person. He remembered the scars on her hands, and the wariness in her eyes, and the flicker of something that might have been hope when he promised to learn what she could teach him. He had not come west looking for love. He had come looking for a life that meant something. But perhaps, if he was very lucky and very persistent, he might find both. Morning came brutally early. Quinn woke to Beatrice pounding on the barn door, calling that it was 6 o'clock and the day was wasting. He stumbled out into dawn light that seemed impossibly bright, his body protesting every movement after the previous day's journey. Beatrice was already saddled on a rangy bay mare, holding the reins of a black gelding that regarded Quinn with what looked like skepticism. "This is Slate," Beatrice said. "He is patient and he knows his job. Do not get in his way and he will keep you in the saddle. Can you mount without help?" Quinn approached the horse cautiously. The animal was larger up close than it had seemed from a distance, and the saddle looked like it was designed for someone who actually knew what they were doing. He got his foot in the stirrup on the second try and hauled himself up with less grace than he would have liked. Slate shifted but did not object, and Quinn settled into the saddle feeling precarious and exposed. "Hold the reins like this," Beatrice demonstrated, her hands easy and relaxed. "He responds to pressure, not pulling. Use your legs to guide him as much as the reins. And for the love of everything holy, do not kick him unless you want him to run." They rode out toward the pasture at a pace that felt alarmingly fast to Quinn, but which he suspected was actually quite slow. The morning air was cool and clear, carrying the scent of grass and earth and distance. The prairie stretched away on all sides, vast and empty in a way that made Quinn's chest feel both tight and open at the same time. In Chicago, you were never more than a few feet from another person, another building, another wall. Here, there was nothing but land and sky and the small dark shapes of cattle in the distance. Beatrice led him through the business of checking the herd, counting heads, looking for signs of injury or illness, making sure none of the animals had gotten tangled in the fence or wandered too far from water. She pointed out each cow and calf, naming them with a combination of numbers and physical descriptions that Quinn immediately knew he would never remember. She showed him how to spot a limp, a clouded eye, the subtle signs that meant an animal was off its feed or starting to sicken. You lose one head to disease, you could lose the whole herd if you do not catch it fast enough, she explained, swinging down from her mare to examine a calf that seemed to be favoring its front leg. Cattle are expensive and they are stupid, and they will die if you let them. Your job is to not let them. The calf turned out to have a thorn in its hoof, which Beatrice removed with practiced efficiency while the mother cow watched suspiciously. Quinn stayed mounted, partly because Beatrice had not told him to dismount, and partly because he was not sure he could get back on the horse if he tried. By the time they returned to the barn, the sun was fully up, and Quinn's legs felt like they might never unbend again. Dismounting was an exercise in controlled falling, and he had to grab the saddle horn to keep from landing face first in the dirt. Beatrice pretended not to notice, which he appreciated. That was the easy part, she said, stripping the saddle from her mare with quick, efficient movements. Now we fix fence. Fence repair, Quinn discovered, was backbreaking work that required skills he did not possess and tools he had never used. Beatrice handed him a post-hole digger and showed him where the old post had rotted through and needed to be replaced. The ground was harder than it looked, full of rocks and roots that caught the digger blades. His hands, soft from years of pen work, blistered within the first hour. By noon, his back felt like it might snap, and his shoulders burned with fatigue. Beatrice worked beside him, digging and setting posts and stringing wire with the steady rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times. She did not complain about the heat or the difficulty, and she did not slow down when Quinn needed to stop and catch his breath. But she did pause to show him a better way to grip the digger handles, and she did share the water jug without comment when he finally admitted he was parched. "You are working harder than I expected," she said during their brief rest. "Most men would have quit by now, or at least complained more." Quinn examined his ruined hands, the blisters already breaking open and bleeding. "I told you I would learn. I did not say it would be pretty." Something shifted in her expression, the wariness easing just slightly. "No, I suppose you did not." They worked until sunset, finishing the fence section and starting on the next one. By the time Beatrice called an end to the day, Quinn could barely walk back to the barn. His whole body screamed with exhaustion and pain, and his hands were raw meat. But he had helped repair 30 feet of fence, and when Beatrice had checked his work, she had nodded and said it would hold. He collapsed on the cot in his clothes and was asleep before full dark. The next days blurred into a pattern of exhaustion and gradual, painful learning. Quinn woke at dawn, worked until his body threatened to quit, and fell asleep counting the new things he had discovered about how much he did not know. He learned to ride Slate with something approaching competence, though the horse still regarded him with patient tolerance rather than respect. He learned to dig post holes without destroying his hands, to string barbed wire without tearing his arms open, to spot a weak board in the corral before it broke under a cow's weight. Beatrice was a patient teacher in her way, showing him each task once and then expecting him to remember. She did not coddle him or make allowances for his inexperience. When he made a mistake, she corrected him matter-of-factly and moved on. When he got something right, she said so and nothing more. She treated him like a working partner, not a charity case, and Quinn found himself grateful for that even when the work made him want to weep. But at night, after the physical labor ended, Quinn started to show what he could actually contribute. He had brought his ledgers and market reports, and he spread them out on the barn floor by lantern light, studying the numbers that governed cattle prices and breeding cycles and feed costs. He calculated how many calves they needed to survive to break even, how many to turn a profit, how much hay they would need to lay in for winter, when to sell steers for the best return. After a week, he walked up to the house after supper and knocked on the door. Beatrice answered with a dish towel in her hands and a question in her eyes. "I have been running the numbers," Quinn said without preamble. "May I show you?" She studied him for a moment, then stepped back to let him in. The house was as spare as the barn. A main room with a table and chairs and a cook stove, and a curtained doorway that presumably led to her bedroom. But it was clean and organized, and it felt like someone had made a home here against all odds. Quinn spread his ledgers on the table and began to explain what he had found. The market reports showed cattle prices rising in the eastern cities, driven by railroad expansion and growing demand. If they could increase their herd size over the next year and time the sales right, they could clear the bank note with room to spare. But they needed to invest now in breeding stock and winter feed, and they needed to be strategic about which animals they kept and which they sold. "You are talking about spending money we do not have to make money we might not get," Beatrice said, her finger tracing the columns of figures. But her tone was thoughtful, not dismissive. "I am talking about using the capital I brought to position us for the best possible return. We can play it safe and scrape by for another year, maybe two, before the bank forecloses. Or we can be smart about this and build something that will last." He pulled out another sheet, covered in his careful handwriting. "I have been writing to stockyards in Omaha and Chicago. I can negotiate better prices than the local buyers offer because I know how they calculate their margins. I also know which breeds are fetching premium prices and why. If we invest in a better bull, we can improve the quality of the calves and get significantly more per head." Beatrice leaned over the table, studying the numbers with an intensity that made Quinn hold his breath. She was so close he could smell the faint scent of soap and summer grass that clung to her hair. Her finger moved down the columns, checking his arithmetic, testing his assumptions. Finally, she straightened and looked at him with something new in her expression. "This could work," she said slowly. "If everything goes right and if we are smart and if we get lucky, this could actually work." "It could," Quinn agreed, "but I cannot do it without you. I can handle the money and the planning, but I need your knowledge and your labor to make any of it real. We are partners in this, Beatrice, equal partners." She held his gaze for a long moment. "You are not what I expected, Quinn Lancaster. Is that a problem? I am not certain yet." But she almost smiled when she said it, and Quinn felt something warm unfurl in his chest. They began working together in a new way after that night. Beatrice still taught him the physical side of ranching, pushing him to learn faster and work harder. But now Quinn taught her too, showing her how to read market reports and understand price fluctuations, how to negotiate with buyers and leverage their knowledge for better deals. They spent evenings at her table, going over the ledgers and planning their strategy, debating which animals to sell and which to keep, calculating risks and potential rewards. Quinn found himself watching her during those sessions, noticing the way her eyes lit up when she understood a new concept, the way she bit her lower lip when she was thinking hard about a problem. She was brilliant in her own way, with an intuitive grasp of animal behavior and land management that no amount of book learning could teach. And she was beautiful, though he suspected she had no idea and would not have cared if she did. He did not let himself think too hard about the fact that he was falling in love with her. That had not been part of the arrangement, and he did not want to complicate their partnership with feelings she might not share. But he could not help the way his heart lifted when she smiled at something he said, or the way he found himself working harder just to earn her approval. Summer deepened, and the work shifted with the seasons. They rode out to check the herd every morning, watching the calves grow and the cows fatten on good grass. They mended equipment and cleared brush and hauled water during the dry spells. Quinn's hands developed calluses, his shoulders broadened from the constant physical labor, and his skin burned and then browned under the relentless prairie sun. The suit he had worn off the train hung in the barn like a relic from another life. One afternoon in late July, as they were riding back from the north pasture, Beatrice pulled up her mare and sat looking at him with an expression he could not quite read. "What?" Quinn asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You look different. I was just realizing I almost did not recognize you." She tilted her head slightly. "You look like you belong here now." Quinn glanced down at himself, the worn work clothes, the dusty boots, the tanned forearms. She was right. Somewhere in the past 2 months, he had stopped being a Chicago bookkeeper playing at ranching. He had become something else, someone who knew how to sit a horse and work a fence line and read weather signs in the sky. "I feel different," he admitted. "I feel like I am finally doing what I was meant to do. Does that sound foolish?" "No." Beatrice nudged her mare forward again, but she was smiling. "It does not sound foolish at all. August brought the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and turned the grass from green to gold." The water level in the creek dropped steadily, and Beatrice grew tense watching the cattle cluster around the shrinking pools. They hauled barrels of water from the well to supplement what nature provided, exhausting work in the brutal sun. And then, on a still afternoon when the heat pressed down like a physical weight, Quinn saw the smoke. It rose in a dark column from the southwest, miles away but moving fast on the wind that had suddenly picked up. Beatrice had ridden into town for supplies, and Quinn was alone when he spotted it. His first thought was that it looked wrong, too black and too spreading. His second thought was that it was moving toward them. He saddled Slate with fumbling hands and rode hard toward the house, his mind racing through everything Beatrice had taught him about prairie fires. They could move faster than a horse could run. They consumed everything in their path. You fought them with backfires and prayer and hope that the wind shifted before you ran out of ground to burn. He reached the barn and started making calculations. The fire was coming from the southwest. If he could create a fire break on that side of the property, burn out a strip of ground before the main fire arrived, it might deflect the flames or at least slow them enough to save the buildings and the herd. It was the kind of strategic thinking he was good at, the kind of planning that came naturally to his methodical mind. But executing it would require doing things he had never done before, with tools he barely knew how to use and no one to help if he made a mistake. He gathered what he needed: shovels, burlap sacks, the wagon tank full of water. He drove the wagon out a quarter-mile from the barn to where the ground rose slightly and the grass was thinnest. The smoke was closer now, and he could smell it on the hot wind. His hands shook as he soaked the burlap sacks and began beating out a line, creating bare earth that would not burn. The work was desperate and terrifying. He lit his own fire with a torch made from kerosene-soaked rags, controlling it as best he could, beating it out when it tried to spread too far, using it to consume the fuel the main fire would need. The heat was incredible, stealing his breath and searing his lungs. Smoke stung his eyes until tears poured down his face. But he kept working, kept thinking, kept executing the plan step by step the way he would work through a complex accounting problem. When Beatrice came racing up the road in the buckboard, the fire brake was holding and the main fire was starting to hit the burned ground and slow. She leaped down before the wagon had fully stopped and ran toward Quinn with terror and fury warring in her expression. "What are you doing? You could have been killed. You should have let it burn and saved yourself. I could not let it take everything you have worked for." His voice was hoarse from smoke, and his lungs burned with every breath. "I had to try." She stared at him like she was seeing him for the first time. The fire was spreading around them now, following the unburned ground north and south, but unable to cross the barrier Quinn had created. It would burn itself out against the creek to the south and the plowed fields of the neighbor to the north. The homestead would survive. "You saved it," Beatrice said, and her voice broke on the words. "You saved everything." They worked together through the long afternoon, making sure the fire brake held and watching for spot fires that might jump the barrier. By sunset, the danger had passed, leaving a blackened landscape and the sharp smell of smoke hanging over everything. They were both filthy, exhausted, and alive. They walked back to the house in the fading light, too tired to ride. At the door, Beatrice turned to face him, and Quinn saw something in her eyes that had not been there before. "I was wrong about you," she said quietly. "I thought you were a mistake. I thought you were a city man playing at a life you could not handle. But you just saved my home and my herd with nothing but stubbornness and planning, and you could have died doing it. That is not a mistake. That is not playing. That is the real thing. I did what needed to be done. That is all. No, you did what I could not have done alone. You used everything you know, everything you are, to solve a problem I would have just fought blindly. We make a good team, Quinn. A better team than I knew how to hope for." Quinn's heart was pounding, and it had nothing to do with the fire. "We do make a good team. But Beatrice, I have to tell you something, and I hope it does not ruin what we have built. I did not come here looking for this, but somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you. I watch you work and teach and plan, and I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever met. I know that was not part of our arrangement. I know you were looking for a partner, not a husband who would complicate things with feelings. But I cannot keep pretending I do not feel this way." She looked at him for a long moment, and Quinn braced himself for rejection, for the careful explanation that they should keep things professional and practical. Instead, she reached up and touched his face, her scarred hand gentle against his smoke-stained cheek. "You think I have not noticed the way you look at me? You think I have not seen how hard you work, how much you care, how you have changed yourself into someone who belongs here?" Her voice was soft but steady. "I fell for you weeks ago, Quinn Lancaster. I fell for you watching you fail and get up and try again without complaint. I fell for you when you sat at my table and showed me that numbers could be hope instead of just fear. I fell for you when you faced down a prairie fire to save a place that is not even yours yet." "It could be mine," Quinn said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "We could be married. We could build this together, not just as partners but as husband and wife, if that is what you want." "That is what I want," Beatrice said. And then she kissed him, and Quinn felt like every choice that had led him to this moment had been exactly right. They were married 3 weeks later in Willow Creek, in a simple ceremony attended by their neighbors and the minister who rode the circuit through the county. Beatrice wore a dress she had made herself from fabric Quinn had bought her as a courting gift, pale blue calico that made her eyes look like summer sky. Quinn wore a new suit, though this one was cut for work instead of city wear, and his boots were scarred and dusty the way they should be. After the ceremony, they rode back to the homestead together in the buckboard, husband and wife and equal partners in every sense. That night, in the house they would now share. Quinn held Beatrice close and felt like he had finally found the place he was meant to be. Autumn came with its work of gathering and sorting and preparing for winter. They had followed Quinn's plan, investing in better breeding stock and negotiating directly with buyers in Omaha. The return was everything he had calculated and more, enough to pay down the bank note and leave capital for improvements. They bought lumber for a new roof, feed for winter, and 2 more breeding cows to add to the herd. Winter tested them with cold that seemed to seep into your bones and snow that piled in drifts against the barn. But they faced it together, checking the herd in the pre-dawn darkness, breaking ice from water troughs, making sure every animal had shelter and food. Quinn learned to read weather signs and animal behavior, to know when a storm was coming before it arrived, to move with the confidence of someone who had earned his place through hard work and persistence. Spring brought new calves and new hope. They worked from dawn until full dark, planting a kitchen garden, repairing winter damage, watching the herd grow. The numbers in Quinn's ledgers showed steady profit, and the bank manager stopped making his monthly visits. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of orange and purple, Beatrice told Quinn she was expecting their first child. The joy that flooded through him was unlike anything he had ever felt, bright and overwhelming and perfect. "We are going to need a bigger house," he said, and she laughed and agreed. Their son Theodore was born the following February during a snowstorm, healthy and squalling and perfect. Quinn held the tiny bundle and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. This was what he had been searching for in all those gray Chicago years: family, purpose, a life that mattered. They continued to build the ranch through the following years, growing the herd and improving the land and earning a reputation for quality stock and fair dealing. Beatrice managed the daily operations with the competence she had always possessed, and Quinn handled the business side, negotiating contracts and tracking markets and planning their expansion. Together, they were formidable. Their daughter Estelle arrived 2 years after Theodore, fierce and determined from her first breath. And then Marcus came along 16 months later, completing their family in a chaos of noise and love and constant motion. The house had been expanded twice by then, growing from 2 rooms to 6, with a real parlor and separate bedrooms for the children. The barn had been rebuilt, larger and sturdier. The herd had grown to over 100 head, and they were acquiring more grazing land as it became available. What had started as a desperate partnership between 2 strangers had become something neither of them could have imagined: a thriving ranch and a deep, abiding love. One Saturday in late summer, 8 years after Quinn had stepped off that train in his city suit, the family loaded into the wagon and drove to the county fair in Willow Creek. Theodore was 6 now, old enough to be fascinated by everything. Estelle was 4 and convinced she could do anything her older brother could do. Marcus was 2 and mostly interested in making sure everyone knew he existed. Quinn had entered several steers in the livestock competition, prime animals that represented everything he and Beatrice had built together. He walked through the fairgrounds with Marcus on his shoulders and the other children running ahead, and he felt the kind of contentment that came from knowing you were exactly where you were supposed to be. When the judging was announced, Quinn's entry took the blue ribbon for finest cattle in the county. He accepted the award while Beatrice stood beside him with Estelle on her hip, and the look they exchanged said more than words ever could. Later, as the sun started to set and the fair lights came on, they stood together watching the children play. Marcus had discovered a fascination with the livestock pens, and was trying to stick his fingers through the fence to touch the sheep. Theodore was explaining the finer points of cattle judging to Estelle, who was mostly ignoring him in favor of planning how to climb the fence. "You ever think about that day at the train station?" Beatrice asked quietly. "When you stepped off wearing that ridiculous suit and I nearly sent you back to Chicago." Quinn pulled her closer, his arm around her waist. "I think about it sometimes. I think about how close I came to missing all of this because I looked wrong." "You did look wrong. You looked like you had no business being here." She smiled up at him. "But you were exactly what I needed, even if I was too stubborn to see it right away. You brought planning and strategy and the ability to think past the next season. You brought capital and education and a different way of seeing problems. And underneath that suit, you brought a good heart and the willingness to work until you got things right. You taught me everything that mattered," Quinn said. "You showed me how to live in this place, how to work this land, how to be the man I wanted to become. I would have failed within a month without you." "We would have both failed without each other," Beatrice corrected. "That was the whole point. We were stronger together than either of us could have been alone." Marcus chose that moment to succeed in climbing the fence, requiring immediate parental intervention. As Quinn scooped up his protesting son and Beatrice went to collect the other two children for the trip home, he took a moment to look around at the life he had built. The ranch that had seemed impossible that first day had become home. The woman who had looked at him with such disappointment had become his wife and partner and the love of his life. The lonely bookkeeper in the pressed suit had become a cattleman and a father and someone who belonged to this wild, beautiful land. He had ordered a partnership by mail and found a family. He had come west looking for purpose and found love. The suit hung forgotten in the back of a closet somewhere, replaced by worn leather and dusty boots, and the kind of life you earned one hard day at a time. As they drove home through the summer dusk, children drowsing in the back of the wagon and Beatrice's hand warm in his, Quinn Lancaster thought about all the choices that had led him here. Leaving Chicago, buying cattle he had never seen, stepping off that train despite knowing how wrong he would look, staying even when Beatrice had every reason to send him away. Every choice had been right. Every risk had been worth it. Every day of hard work and learning and gradual transformation had led him exactly where he needed to be. The prairie rolled away on all sides, golden in the fading light, and Quinn knew with absolute certainty that he would never want to be anywhere else. This was home. This was family. This was the life he had been meant to live all along. And as the wagon rolled up to the house he had helped build, surrounded by land he had helped claim, next to the woman who had changed everything, Quinn Lancaster smiled and understood that some things were worth every sacrifice, every struggle, every moment of doubt. He had stepped off a train wearing the wrong clothes and become exactly the right man. Not because he had changed who he was, but because he had found the place where who he was mattered. Where his planning and his persistence and his willingness to learn had combined with Beatrice's knowledge and strength and courage to create something neither could have built alone. The children stumbled sleepy into the house, while Beatrice started putting together a late supper. Quinn unhitched the wagon and settled the horses for the night, moving through the familiar tasks with the easy competence of long practice. Tomorrow would bring more work, fences to check, cattle to tend, ledgers to update, a ranch to run and a family to provide for. But tonight, he stood in the barn doorway looking at the house where light spilled from the windows and his family waited, and he let himself feel the full weight of his gratitude. For the advertisement he had answered, for the woman who had given him a chance despite his unsuitability, for the land that had tested him and shaped him and made him into someone worthy of this life. He had been the wrong man in the wrong clothes arriving on the wrong train. But in the end, everything had turned out exactly right. And as Quinn walked toward the house and the life he had built, he carried with him the certain knowledge that love, like ranching, was about finding the right partner and being willing to work hard enough to make the impossible become real. The door opened before he reached it, and Beatrice stood silhouetted in the light, waiting for him the way she had waited every evening for 8 years, waiting for him to come home. Waiting for the man who had stepped off that train and stayed when he could have run, who had learned what she taught him and taught her what she needed to know, who had faced fire and winter and endless hard work without complaint. Quinn climbed the steps and took her hand, and together they walked into the warm house where their children were giggling over some private joke, and the smell of supper filled the air. This was what he had traveled halfway across the country to find. Not just land or success or security, though they had achieved all of those things, but this: belonging, purpose, love that deepened with every shared sunrise and every challenge faced together. The train had brought him here wearing the wrong clothes and carrying the wrong skills. But the woman who had met him with disappointment in her eyes had seen past the surface to the determination underneath. She had given him the chance to prove himself, and he had taken that chance and transformed it into something neither of them could have predicted. As they sat down to supper with their children chattering around them, Quinn caught Beatrice's eye across the table and saw his own contentment reflected back at him. They had built this together: the ranch, the family, the life that stretched ahead of them full of possibility. They had taken a practical arrangement between strangers and turned it into something extraordinary. Outside, the prairie night settled over the land they had claimed and improved and made their own. Inside, the family they had created together filled the house with warmth and noise and love. And somewhere in the back of the closet, a pressed city suit gathered dust, a reminder of the man Quinn Lancaster had been before he learned what he was truly capable of becoming. The years continued their steady march forward, bringing challenges and triumphs in equal measure. There were droughts that tested their water management and winters that pushed the herd to its limits. There were seasons when the market prices dropped, and Quinn had to negotiate harder than ever to keep them profitable. There were illnesses that swept through the cattle and required all of Beatrice's knowledge to contain. But they faced everything together, partners in the truest sense, and they emerged stronger each time. The children grew and learned the ranch alongside their parents. Theodore showed Quinn's head for numbers and planning, already helping update the breeding records by the time he was 8. Estelle had her mother's intuitive understanding of animals and could gentle a skittish calf with patience and soft words. Marcus was still young but showed signs of combining both parents' strengths, equally comfortable in the barn and looking over the ledgers. The community came to respect the Lancasters as examples of what could be achieved through hard work and partnership. Other ranchers sought Quinn's advice on market timing and breeding strategies. Women asked Beatrice how she managed to balance the ranch work with family. And everyone remembered the story of how Quinn had arrived in a city suit and Beatrice had nearly sent him back, and how the two of them had built something remarkable from that unpromising beginning. On their 10th anniversary, Quinn took Beatrice into town and bought her the one thing she had never allowed herself: a beautiful dress from the catalog, impractical and lovely, the color of spring wildflowers. She had protested that they did not need such things, that the money could be better used for ranch improvements. But Quinn had insisted, and when she wore it to church the following Sunday, he thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I still cannot believe you stayed," Beatrice said one evening as they sat on the porch after the children had gone to bed. The summer air was soft and warm, carrying the sound of cattle settling for the night and the first crickets of the season. When I think about how I treated you that first day, how disappointed I was, how sure I was that you could not possibly be what I needed, I am amazed you did not climb right back on that train. Quinn reached for her hand, their fingers interlacing with the easy familiarity of long partnership. I stayed because I saw something in your eyes that I recognized. You were desperate and trying to hide it, holding on to your father's dream with both hands even though it was slipping away. I understood that feeling. I had been holding on to a life in Chicago that was suffocating me, too afraid to let go and reach for something better. When I saw you standing there in the dust, I thought maybe we could help each other hold onto the right dreams this time. You did more than help me hold on, Beatrice said softly. You helped me build something bigger than I ever imagined. This ranch, our family, everything we have now is because you were brave enough to step off that train looking wrong but being exactly right. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The prairie stretched away on all sides, and Quinn marveled at how something that had once felt impossibly vast and foreign now felt like the only place he could ever belong. I love you, he said, simple and true. I loved you when you were teaching me to dig post holes and trying not to laugh at how bad I was at it. I loved you when we sat at your table planning how to save the ranch. I loved you when you kissed me after the fire. And I love you more with every day that passes, every challenge we face together, every moment of our life. I love you too, Beatrice replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. My unexpected cowboy who arrived in a suit and stayed to become the best partner and husband I could have asked for. Inside the house, one of the children called out in sleep, and Beatrice rose to check on them. Quinn remained on the porch a moment longer, breathing in the prairie air and thinking about the journey that had brought him here. From a cramped office in Chicago to this vast, open land. From a lonely bookkeeper to a husband and father and successful cattleman. From a stranger in wrong clothes to someone who belonged so completely he could not imagine any other life. When he finally went inside, Beatrice was settling Marcus back into sleep, her hand gentle on their son's forehead. Quinn stood in the doorway watching her, this remarkable woman who had given him a chance when she had no reason to, who had taught him everything that mattered, who had loved him not despite being different from what she expected, but because he had been willing to become what they both needed. The years ahead would bring their own challenges and joys. The children would grow and perhaps take over the ranch one day, or perhaps strike out to build their own dreams. The cattle market would rise and fall, the weather would bring good seasons and bad, and life would continue its unpredictable course. But whatever came, Quinn knew they would face it together, the way they had faced everything from that first uncertain meeting at the train station. He had stepped off the train wearing a suit, and she had ordered a cowboy. What they had found instead was something better than either had imagined. A partnership built on mutual respect and hard work. A love that deepened with every shared sunrise, and a life that proved that sometimes the best things come from being brave enough to take a chance on the unexpected. As Quinn finally climbed into bed beside his wife, in the house they had built on the land they had claimed together, he thought about that young bookkeeper who had boarded a train heading west with no idea what he would find. He wished he could tell that younger self not to be afraid, that the woman waiting at the station would be disappointed at first, but would become the most important person in his life. That the work would be harder than anything he could imagine but more satisfying than he ever dared hope. That the man he would become would be someone he could be proud of, forged through challenge and love into exactly who he was meant to be. But perhaps That younger self had known something all along. Perhaps that was why he had answered the advertisement in the first place, why he had bought cattle sight unseen and traveled halfway across the country to meet a stranger. Perhaps some part of him had understood that the only way to find what he was searching for was to be brave enough to step into the unknown, even if it meant arriving in the wrong clothes and having to prove himself from scratch. The prairie wind whispered against the window, and beside him, Beatrice stirred in her sleep, reaching for his hand even in dreams. Quinn held on and let himself drift into sleep, content and grateful and home at last. The suit that had marked him as an outsider was long forgotten, replaced by the dust and sweat and honest work that had earned him his place. And in the morning, there would be cattle to check and fences to mend, and a life to continue building, one day at a time together.